The Mauritanian, based on the New York Times best-selling memoir Guantánamo Diary by Mohamedou Ould Slahi. This is the true story of Slahi's fight for freedom after being detained and imprisoned without charge by the US government for years. We open up on a beach where Mohamedou is walking in Mauritania, Northwest Africa in November 2001, 2 months after 9/11. We see him attending a family wedding with dancing and singing. His friends talk to him about Germany, then a man takes him aside and whispers something in his ear. He goes outside to where a policeman is waiting and tells him that for the last time he has no idea where his cousin Mahfouz is. The policeman tells Mohamedou that since 9/11 the Americans are going crazy and they want to talk with him. Mohamedou agrees to go with them but asks to change out first. When he does, he also quickly erases all the contacts on his cell phone. He asks if he can drive himself to the station and the policeman agrees. Mohamedou's mother is distraught, but he reassures her that they won't let him take his own car if he wasn't coming back. We cut to Albuquerque, New Mexico in February 2005. High-powered lawyer Nancy Hollander steps in the back of the court and sits behind Teresa Duncan and asks for a copy of her case file for something involving airlines. Later she meets a French lawyer, Emmanuel, for lunch, and he tells her that the lawyer from Mauritania approached his firm in Paris on behalf of Mohamedou's family. They haven't seen Mohamedou since he was arrested 3 years ago. Emmanuel asks Nancy to look into it. Nancy agrees to check but can't get a straight answer on the phone as to whether or not Mohamedou is at Guantanamo. This piques her interest and she tells her colleague at a meeting that she wants to take the case. It will only be her working on the case plus someone to translate. She asks Terry if she can speak French and Terry says yes and agrees to come. Then we see a bunch of military men at the Naval Law Conference. Marine prosecutor Stuart Coach is recognized and called aside by Colonel Belseidel, who asks to talk with him about the case. Seidel tells Stu the case they want him to prosecute is Mohamedou, who they say fought with Al-Qaeda in 90s, and says it was Mohamedou who recruited the terrorist who flew Stu's friend's plane into the tower. Stu asks when to start. Nancy and Terry fly down to Guantanamo to meet Mohamedou. When they get to the prison, they are each given a notepad and a pen. Any notes they take will have to be left there and then picked up later at a secure facility in the States. They are brought to a room with a table to meet Mohamedou. They will be monitored by a camera. Mohamedou stands and shakes both their hands and pulls them into hugs, which unnerves them. Terry starts to speak French to him, but Mohamedou surprises them by speaking English. Nancy explains they are there because they wish to represent him. He seems reluctant to trust them, even though Nancy makes clear they are not in any way related to the US government. Mohamedou asks how they can defend him when he hasn't even charged with anything in 3 years. He says he was kidnapped and taken to a prison in Jordan and then Afghanistan before brought him here in chains, and that he is interrogated 18 hours a day. He says the only evidence they have shown him is that he once answered a call from Bin Laden's satellite phone, which shocks the lawyers, but he adds that it was his cousin and he didn't know what phone it was. He is afraid to talk to them in case the guards are listening, so Nancy suggests he write it down. Mohamedou agrees to hire them and gives Terry a number to call his mother. We then see Stu going over the information they have about Mohamedou with his team. Mohamedou got a scholarship to study engineering in Germany in '88 and 2 years later went to Afghanistan and joined Al-Qaeda. They talk about his cousin Mahfouz. We see Terry and Nancy go to a secure facility in Virginia, which is where they can read the notes they take at Guantanamo. We flash back to Mohamedou arriving at Guantanamo in 2002. He is being shouted at by guards while his head is in a black hood. He's roughly scrubbed down and given a wrist tag with his photo on it. They dress him and take him to a cell. His cell is small with no window and he is provided with some toiletries, a Quran and a prayer rock. He lies on the bed and thinks of traveling across the desert with his father when he was young. The next morning he is roughly awoken and taken to an interrogation room where he meets 2 interrogators from US government and a translator. The interrogators tells him they will not hurt him, but they need him to answer their questions. They ask about him joining Al-Qaeda in 90s. We flash back to Mohamedou. They are learning to use a machine gun. We then see him at Guantanamo in an outside cell. He hears another prisoner being put in the cell next to him and talks to him in Arabic. Mohamedou asks his name. The guy tells him he is from Marseille. Mohamedou calls him Marseille. We return to the present, where Nancy interrupts Emmanuel at the restaurant. She wants him to check with his connection in France to verify Mohamedou's story about Marseille, since that will help prove he is being truthful. Meanwhile, Stu team finds out Nancy is representing Mohamedou, and Stu looks her up, finding out she's been fighting the government since the Vietnam War. Stu sees that an old friend of his, Neil, signed off on a lot of the reports. He meets Neil at a bar. Stu asks if Neil can help him with any information about Mohamedou's case, as he used to work on that case. Neil is doubtful, saying Guantanamo was churning out memoirs, and Stu asks what those are. Neil explains that what Stu is reading in his case files are the intelligence reports that summarize what was said and done, but the memoirs are the notes of what actually happened in real time. Stu wants to see them, but Neil says they are classified. Mohamedou sends Nancy and Terry more letters. Kent at the privileged team reads them through, redacting and blacking out some parts, then faxes them to Nancy's office. We cut back to Mohamedou's initial interrogation, where he explains to his interrogators that he's never met Bin Laden. They say they know he got a call from his cousin on Bin Laden's phone right after his cousin sends him money, but Mohamedou says it was because the cousin's father was sick and the money was for hospital bills, but that he has no proof because they brought him there naked. We cut to another interrogation a few months later, where they confront Mohamedou with a picture of Ramzi bin al-Shib, the 20th hijacker. Mohamedou denies knowing him at all, then admits he met him one time. The interrogators are getting frustrated at him. It is now October 2005, and Nancy and Terry enter the secure facility to find boxes and boxes of files. However, when they open them, they find that every line of every file has been redacted and blacked out. Meanwhile, Stu is looking through those same files unredacted at his office. Stu goes over to Neil's house and talks to him alone in the kitchen. Neil again says he can't help him with anything classified and can't get the memoirs. But Stu says if he doesn't find something that definitively proves what Mohamedou said, he will go free. Neil suggests Stu go down to Guantanamo himself and talk to the man in charge, General Mandel. We see Nancy and Terry meeting with Mohamedou again. Nancy reassures him that they have gotten his letters and asks him to keep writing and asks his approval to sue the government for access to their files. He agrees to sue, especially since the people he will be suing are George Bush and Donald Rumsfeld. At the airport, while she is browsing the airport gift shop, she is recognized by Stu, who is there to meet the general. He introduces himself and asks her to have a drink. She asks Stu while he is keeping the case files from her, and he seems surprised and says he is not. She tells him about the redacted files, and he says she should be sued to see them, and that he actually wants her to have them so that when he wins in court, there will be no doubt about Mohamedou's guilt. He asks why he is defending someone like that, and she says she's all defending the law. Stu is given a tour of Guantanamo by a soldier who takes him into an empty cell and sees it has rings for chains on the walls and floor and notes how cold it is. He starts hearing loud metal music coming from another room and looks troubled, saying the two kinds of music he hates are heavy metal and country. He then meets the General Mandel and asks him if the things he saw in the cell mean they are using sleep deprivation on the prisoners. The general says it's one of their tools. He adds it was just a couple of sleepless nights. Stu is worried that this means the defense might be able to claim duress, and the general says he knows Stu wants to see the memoirs, but he can't allow it, and he wasted his trip. We flash back again to Mohamedou's time in Guantanamo. When he gets outside, he tries telling Marseille some of the bad words he learned in English, but Marseille sounds depressed. He says he got a letter from his wife, and he asks if Mohamedou is married, and we flash back to him living in Germany with his ex-wife. Mohamedou and his friends are watching the news on TV about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This leads us to another one of Mohamedou's interrogations, where the interrogators are now yelling at him about choosing to join Al-Qaeda. He tries to explain that he just wanted to help the Muslims fight the Soviet, and the US was on Al-Qaeda's side as well. He says he was only there for a few months. They ask why he then deleted the contacts on his phone. He says he just didn't want his friends to get in trouble. Then we see him outside again. When he finds the soccer ball in his cell, he asks Marseille if he wants it back, and Marseille says to keep it. He hears the guards come to take Marseille away, and Mohamedou managed to see him for the first time. Back in the present, we see Nancy on the phone with Emmanuel, who says he can't find any evidence about a French person from Marseille being at Guantanamo, and that maybe Mohamedou made him up. We flash back to Mohamedou walking with the guard from before, and he begs him to tell him what happened to Marseille because he hasn't heard him in a long time. Steve, one of the guards, admits to Mohamedou that Marseille killed himself a month ago, and Mohamedou crushes. We jump ahead to 2008 as Terry and Nancy go to court to argue for access to the government files and find a group of pro-US protesters outside. They yell at the lawyers and even knock Terry down. In court, Nancy successfully argues that the government should release the files, and the judge orders them to hand them over in 10 days. When they go to the secure facility, there are tons of boxes of files again, this time unredacted. They start going through them. Terry starts to freak out because she finds copy of confessions Mohamedou has written and signed, admitting to everything the government is accusing him of. She is upset because she genuinely believed in him. Nancy angrily tells her that he still deserves representation, even if he is guilty, and tells her to get out. Terry tearfully leaves. We go back to Mohamedou being interrogated. His interrogators have brought him cake, saying it's a goodbye present. They warn him these interrogators won't be friendly and wish him luck. As they leave, soldiers come in and roughly chain Mohamedou up, ripping up his notebook and throwing a hood over his head before dragging him away. Back in the prison, Nancy has come to visit Mohamedou. He asks where Terry is and Nancy says she has moved on from the case, which disappoints him. She tells him they got the government files and he is pleased. Nancy brings up the confession and Mohamedou starts getting jumpy, saying they were nothing and that they made him sign them. Nancy asks what he means by that, but he's afraid to tell her. She says to write it down. Later, Stu throwing a Christmas party and finds Neil. He tells Neil he didn't like what he saw at Guantanamo. He's angry that he can't get the memoirs because if Mohamedou goes free, he will have to answer for it. At Guantanamo, Mohamedou is agitated about writing to Nancy, but finally gets up the courage. And Nancy gets notification that she has a new letter to read. We see Stu in his office at night. Neil shows up, having had a change of heart, and explains that Donald Rumsfeld authorized them to use enhanced interrogation, aka torture, and that an aide will take Stu to a room where he can read the memoirs. Nancy reads Mohamedou's letter as Stu looks at the reports, and we see what happened. Mohamedou was taken to a cold cell with no amenities by masked soldiers. He is chained to a stand in a stressed position for hours as lights flash and heavy metal music blasts, keeping him awake for days. They waterboard him, pouring water onto his face. He starts to hallucinate that he is back at the family wedding. An exhausted and delirious Mohamedou is told by General Mandel that since Mohamedou isn't cooperating, they are going to arrest his mother and bring her here. He is then put back in the stressed position and thinks he sees another prisoner there who he thinks is his mother until it's revealed to be another person in a mask. He starts screaming. He is then in his old interrogation room and the female soldiers from before comes in and takes off her mask. She says they want to stop, but he has to tell them what he knows. Before he can answer, other soldiers break down the door and drag him off as she screams. They put another hood over his head and take him on a speedboat, repeatedly holding his head in the water. Exhausted, Mohamedou is then revisited by General Mandel, who says his mother has been arrested and will probably be raped if she comes here. Mohamedou prays in his cell, then tells the guard he would like to confess. Stu is horrified by what he has read, and Nancy has tears in her eyes. We see Stu finds Colonel Seidel in the parking lot and tells him he can't bring charges against Mohamedou because his confession were given under torture and that what happened to him was reprehensible. Seidel angrily says he doesn't care about prisoner treatment and that his job is to bring charges. Stu says that he can't, as a Christian and as a lawyer, prosecute the case. Seidel calls him a traitor. We then see Nancy visiting Mohamedou. She says she read his letters and she thinks they have a case against the government. Stu packs up his desk and leaves his office. Later he meets Nancy at a bar and she tells him he did the right thing. The next day, Terry comes to work and finds an envelope on her desk. Inside is a proof that Mohamedou passed lie detector test twice. It shows he was telling the truth. Terry shows Nancy a photo. She was able to identify Marseille. His name was Ahmed Jabbar and she spoke to his wife. Nancy asked Terry to be on the case again. We jump to December 2009. Mohamedou's case is at trial. Mohamedou is able to testify over video link to the court, saying that in Mauritania you know not to trust the police and the government because they use violence and fear to control you. He says that the US has been doing the same thing to him at Guantanamo, that he has been a prisoner for 8 years without being charged or brought to trial, but he doesn't hold a grudge against the people who abused him. He says that in Arabic the word for forgiveness is the same word as freedom, and that is how he is able to be free here. In March 2010, Mohamedou gets a letter and finds out his case was successful and the judge has been ordered that he be released. He high-fives the guards and jumps on his bed. But right as he is shouting freedom, we cut to a text telling us that it would be actually another 7 years before he was released because the government appealed. His mother died in 2013 and he never saw her again. Throughout that time, Nancy and Terry kept visiting him and helped him publish his letters as a book, Guantánamo Diary, in 2015. He was finally released in 2016, having spent 14 years in prison without ever being charged. We see him being taken out of his cell and walk to the military plane. As they place a blindfold and noise-cancelling headphones on him, he smiles and says, "See you later, alligator." We see footage of the real Mohamedou arriving back in Mauritania. Then photos and text show us the real people in the case.